Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. Yes. Hello, everybody. As Sarah said, my name is Michael Barron. I'm an independent consultant based in the UK. I used to work, actually, I feel a bit of an intruder here because I actually used to work in the oil and gas sector rather than the mining sector. But I've had a long association one way or another with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. So it is a great pleasure to welcome to the floor or to the stage Mark Robinson, the Executive Director of EITI since 2018, I think it was. We're going to change the format here. So rather than do a presentation, it's going to be more like what's sometimes called a fireside chat. So a series of questions, cover some of the topics we've been looking at over this session, so about risk and critical minerals and so forth. But before we do that, Mark, maybe for the benefit of those in the audience who are maybe less familiar with EITI, if you could just briefly introduce the initiative and say a bit about how it works and its role in improving or bringing transparency and accountability, in this case, particularly to the mining sector. I know EITI covers oil and gas, but we are talking more about mining today. So, Mark, with that, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and many thanks, Sarah, to you for the kind invitation. So the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, is a global multi-stakeholder initiative set up to tackle the problems of poor governance and corruption risk in oil, gas, and mining worldwide. And we are now 56 member countries. About 65 leading oil, gas, and mining companies support our work, and possibly 800 civil society groups around the world engaged in EITI implementation. So we in Oslo, where I'm based at the International Secretariat, provide support to EITI implementation around what we call the EITI standard, a reporting framework right along the extractives value chain on which countries need to report progress. And we also conduct periodic assessments, which we call validation, which we then publish with recommendations how countries can improve transparency across the sector.
Thank you. And so with that, as you say, the EITI standard has been in place for about 10 years, and the EITI itself has been in existence for about 20 years. Last year, you updated the EITI standard, and energy transition was very much one of the themes of that update. So people listening and watching this, what can they expect to see in this EITI reporting that will be useful in terms of understanding the risks around the exploration and exploitation of critical minerals in the 56 implementing countries?
Sure. I mean, the defining purpose of EITI is to support countries in their quest to increase revenues from the sector, oil, gas, and mining, but also to tackle and curb corruption risk. Those have been have been the defining features of our work over 20 years. What changed 4 or 5 years ago when I and Helen Clark, as our board chair, came in is recognizing that the context in which we work is rapidly changing, and we could no longer ignore the significance, the impact of the energy transition. So with that, our board, the board took a decision to develop a series of policies to further our work and contribution to the energy transition, and then brought it into the EITI standard last year, the 2023 standard. So there's already in the existing standard a number of provisions which help countries as they confront and tackle governance and corruption risks. Some of those include, for example, contract disclosure, which has been there now for at least 8 years and is now a mandatory requirement. All governments need to put contracts into the public domain as of January 2021 that they enter into with private companies. That's absolutely fundamental to safe, sustainable mineral supply chains, because those companies engaging in contracts need predictability. They need to know that the counterparts they're working with are acting in good faith. And of course, it's important for those that they work with in joint ventures and other contractual arrangements. So that's been long in place, along with beneficial ownership transparency, in order to understand the real owners of companies. That's really important for companies which are entering into many complex contracts with companies that may not be publicly registered, state-owned enterprises, to understand who's the real owners. Are there vested interests there, or politically exposed persons who have a strong personal stake in making corrupt proceeds from transactions? So those, and I suppose the third one, Michael, I draw attention to, which is pre-existing and fundamental for supply chain risk management, is around commodity trading transparency, a requirement that the volumes and the sales of commodities by commodity traders are put in the public domain. And in my mind, this is one of the most important, because what people often forget about in the excitement about critical raw materials is actually how they collected, stored, and transported. This is vital, and that's where a lot of the corruption risk lies. So that's what's already there. What changed last year is new provisions around public policies of governments around the energy transition, declaring their own policy framework, which many governments have only still been developing, including how they publicize subsidy regimes. This is important across both sectors, particularly in oil and gas, but also around some mining as well. A second one is publication of information about reserves. Now, that was a big fight in amongst my different constituencies, and it sounds very innocuous, but it's absolutely fundamental for countries and companies to, or countries to publish information about known reserves of minerals and other extractives. And the third one is around better forecasts, excuse me, of revenues from the sector going forward and putting that to the public domain. All this body of information is designed to deepen the way in which this standard can add information on the energy transition, Michael.
Thank you. I'm sure that's raised, especially for Sarah, given her mind background, raised lots of questions. So Sarah, I know you're probably itching to come in.
Yeah, so Mark, with regards to all of that, so you've mentioned some of those changes perhaps that are going on in the broader world at the moment with regards to those aspects that are addressed perhaps within EITI. Are you seeing that there are some really good partnerships and collaborations, and so therefore influencing of either how EITI is being updated, but then also how other agreements, guidance, etc. are put together? Do you see any of that?
Yeah, there is important cross-fertilization. You may be aware there's a conversation happening in New York as we speak, which is looking for better harmonization of a number of reporting standards. In this case, not the EITI, but aspects of the EITI report inform this, designed to lessen the reporting burden on companies, which many are feeling at the moment. Because since the EITI was created 20 years ago, there's been a number of other standards that have evolved around particular metals, around aspects of the value chain. So we are, in fact, my colleague, my deputy is in New York and part of that discussion to make sure that our focus on governance and on community engagement is very strongly reflected in whatever they then produce. So ICMM and their companies, who are all members of the EITI, a key partner. On the NGO side, there's a number of key NGOs that play a very important advocacy role around giving emphasis to these sorts of priorities and to hold companies and governments accountable for their public commitments on what they wish to do to improve governance, whether under the EITI or other reporting frameworks. So those are two very, very important segments that we work with. And then you have institutional frameworks like the OECD's due diligence guidance on supply chains in conflict-affected environments. You have the World Bank playing an important role around a number of agreements and funding mechanisms that we also work closely with. So we are part of a much broader institutional framework and set of partnerships as opposed to going it alone. Although when we started out 20 years ago, that was a pretty lonely furrow. There was very few other actors in this domain and very little information and data in the public domain. And my gosh, that's changed, and partly as a result of our collective efforts.
Thanks, Mark. Michael, back to you.
Yeah, so actually on that last point, as you say, EITI has put a lot of information and data into the public domain. How are, and you mentioned NGOs there and the companies, both of which are, important, two of the three key constituents in the EITI, particularly NGOs, not just for advocacy, but how are NGOs, civil society organizations, using EITI information that comes out through the EITI process to have impact, to affect real training, to improve transparency and accountability in the country, in the EITI implementing countries? Or indeed, are there any instances of it being used outside of EITI, but EITI
one of the most
countries?
important networks in that regard is the Natural Resource Governance Institute, a sort of advocacy-oriented think tank which is present in many EITI countries. They're a big user of our data, whether it's to have a repository of information they can feed their state-owned enterprise database, whether it informs their guidance on anti-corruption in the extractive sector. So that's probably one of the best examples of how our data is used by an organization, both to inform its constituents, but also to support its advocacy efforts. Oxfam International is another big user of our data and also has helped feed in and develop some of our own standard itself. They're not just recipients of, but they actively shape the way in which the standard has been evolving over the years. So it's a two-way street in that respect. And both of them have extensive networks in many of the countries we work in. So our primary engagement in terms of country involvement is that their associate bodies or partners on the ground who take part in the EITI multi-stakeholder groups. So they provide that mechanism between our data, ensuring it's taken up and used both for global policy, but also for country level efforts. And increasingly at the subnational level to inform local communities. Now that's a massive task, just simply given the sheer number of mining sites around the world. But we are experimenting at the moment with what kinds of information from EITI can be used by community level organizations to inform local public debate and awareness of the potential benefits that should accrue to local communities from new investments. What are the transfers coming from governments? What are the job opportunities that should be available from new investments? All of that now has been fed in part by some of our data, particularly in Latin America, Peru and Colombia, where there's already subnational EITI implementation taking place.
Thank you. And just maybe a final question for me on companies, and coming close to my heart, coming from a private sector background. As you said, the standard has evolved over the last 10 years, and the latest iteration was published in June 2023. And that the latest version seems to put a lot more obligations on companies to disclose information. You talked about anti-corruption policies. There's obligations around environmental and social impact assessments and other things. And we've talked earlier this afternoon a lot about small and medium-sized mining companies. So the question is, which may not have the resources or the capacity to manage much of this. So what are the expectations, and in your view, on small and medium-sized mining companies to contribute to EITI in the implementing countries?
Let me start with how we work with companies more broadly. Until recently, until the last few years, there hasn't been any reporting obligations on companies, because the standard is primarily reporting for governments, who then in turn collect information about companies in their respective countries. Now, what we brought in 2 years ago was a set of expectations for company reporting. That's for the member companies of the EITI, mainly the publicly listed companies and increasingly a number of SOEs. 9 expectations, some of which you listed just now. Do they have a published position on combating corruption? Are they committed to contract transparency? Do they publish their beneficial owners, paralleling the EITI standard? And we last year then undertook a stock take about how far our companies actually living up to that set of expectations. And that was published initially in aggregate and now by each individual company. So there's a very extensive data set on our website, which can be mined. So each individual company can be measured up against these standards, which is very useful for ESG reporting, of course. Now, your question was more about companies in country and the smaller companies. Huge numbers of companies have to provide data for government reporting on the EITI. It probably amounts to several thousand. And what we find is, of course, the mining sector often is dominated by a few large players, many of them international companies, some of them domestic, and some of them SOEs. But you have a very, very large tail of medium and small scale enterprises, of course. And a significant segment of them do report on the EITI, but each country makes a decision about what is the level of materiality, how significant does their production investment need to be before they're obliged to report. So it doesn't make sense for very, very small micro companies, family-based companies, to report because it's so tiny in the wider realm of government reporting. But nevertheless, there are just take, say, Chile, a country which is committed to joining EITI, hopefully to be our next member before the end of the year, where the sector is dominated by large companies, both domestic and international, but there's a very large sector of medium-sized, family-based mining companies. They will be reporting through the EITI, and they're collected and represented through an association in Chile, which until quite recently was not particularly enamored with the idea of having to open up and to report through the EITI. But that conversation has been taking place, and gradually the recognition that actually that can be a good thing in terms of creating investor confidence and bringing more money into the sector. So there are limits to the reporting insofar as micro industries cannot and would not report through the EITI. But there's still a very significant segment of medium and small companies that do and should.
And I think we're probably out of time, so I'm going to hand back to Sarah to wrap up. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very, very much, Michael, but also thank you so much, Mark, for joining us here today and being grilled by all of Michael's questions there on EITI and a lot of the change that actually it's helped to instigate across the world. So thank you very much to both Mark and to Michael. Round of applause to both of you. Fantastic. Excellent.